Hopes are high as the UN sponsors talks to end the fighting in Libya. The negotiations in Geneva are seen by some as the last chance for peace. But what if they fail? And what purpose do they serve in the absence of some of the main players? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finighan. They fought side by side just 4 years ago to bring down the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. But with their common enemy gone, militias have now turned against each other. One faction, known as Libya Dawn, took over the capital Tripoli last August. And that forced the internationally recognised government to set up base in eastern Libya. And throughout it all, fighting between militias has killed hundreds of civilians. The United Nations says that talks that began on Wednesday in Geneva could be the last chance for peace. But even the talks themselves are controversial, with some members of the faction in Tripoli refusing to attend. Al Jazeera's Zaina Hoda in Geneva sets up our discussion for us.
These people represent several of Libya's warring factions. They have agreed to talk to each other in what the UN says could be the last chance for peace. But it's not clear how they can agree on a national unity government when some factions chose to stay away from the talks in Geneva. The Tripoli-based General National Congress was one of them. It is one of Libya's two parliaments. A few days ago, it did say it was open to dialogue, but expressed reservations on the mechanism put in place.
We insist on dialogue to prevent bloodshed, and because Libyans are one. They are one people, and they have to agree to reach an agreement that will bring them together. There is no difference between Eastern Libyan, Western, Northern, or Southern.
But for the UN Special Envoy, conciliatory statements were not enough. Bernardina Leon made clear that those who chose not to be part of the talks are choosing war, which won't be acceptable to the international community.
What you mean by spoilers is the people who want war and not peace. I think it has to be very clear that after some time making a huge effort to bring many people from many different realms to the table, their time is finished. And the international community, and I am in touch with the most important international regional actors. I'm in touch, of course, with the representatives of the Security Council, and the international community, for those who want war, will have no more patience. This is very clear.
Since the fall of the Gaddafi regime, successive governments couldn't assert state authority across the country. Libya now has rival parliaments, two armies, and scores of militias. Each faction says they're the legitimate rulers. The UN envoy said this process would be long and difficult, but at the same time he made clear there is no other option apart from Libya descending into further chaos. The question is whether these talks will be meaningful if all players aren't involved. That includes the powerful armed groups whose backing of any deal is needed to avoid further violence. The international community is growing increasingly concerned about the situation in Libya. The country is at the doorsteps of Europe, and groups the UN lists as terrorist organizations have taken advantage of the security vacuum there. The international community seems to have lost patience, but what is not clear is whether they will take further action if the political process fails. Zaina Hoda, Al Jazeera, Geneva.
Well, the talks in Geneva are being held at a time when the political situation in oil-rich Libya is in chaos, and the United Nations says this could be the last chance for peace. But representatives from some of the factions in Tripoli have chosen not to attend the UN talks, and for that they blame Bernardino Leon, the head of the UN mission in Libya. The fighters who stayed behind say they're concerned by the way the negotiations were organised. They say that Leon announced the date and venue without consulting them first, and their absence at the peace talks may mean that any progress in Geneva could be undermined back in Tripoli. All right, so let's bring in our guests for today's Inside Story. From Beirut, we're joined by Anas Al-Gomati, who's the director of the Tripoli-based Sadeq Institute. And from Washington, D.C., Manal Omar from the United States Institute of Peace. Manal served as international advisor for the Libya Stabilisation team in Benghazi in 2011. Welcome to you both. Anas Al-Gomati, we'll start with you first. Do these talks in Geneva serve any purpose right now? I mean, what's the point if one side isn't even in attendance.
Well, I think to speak about one side not being in attendance yet, and I think that perhaps there may be a vote either today or tomorrow, and that some of the delegates may arrive on Sunday. But I think we have to speak about more broadly Libya Dawn, and Libya Dawn is a broken coalition in of itself. And even if we were to have some of the representatives from the General National Congress, it doesn't necessarily mean that they all speak for Libya Dawn in the very same way that some of the representatives that are attending in Geneva from Operation Dignity don't all speak for Operation Dignity. And I think the purpose ultimately is to find a narrative that suits some of the members so they can go back to their respective constituencies and begin to break down the really toxic narrative, which is it's a zero-sum game, it's winner takes all. That is the first step, and as I think Bernardino Leon has already mentioned, this is a first step in a very, very long process. The purpose is, just to get everything, or to get the ball rolling effectively, and to try to get everyone to sign into a narrative that suits everyone there, not about the points that they don't agree with, but the points that they do actually agree with, and to take it from there. So I think there is a good purpose there.
You've got to start somewhere, I suppose. It's going to take a long time, as Mr. Bernardino Leon has said, but how long? Are we talking months here? Are we talking years even?
It could take years, and I think some of the deeper, more ingrained problems in Libya, because of the fact that none of the warring parties, none of the militant factions will be in attendance in Geneva. And I think the previous agreements that had come from Ghadames, the ceasefire agreements that came only a few months ago, they failed because the warring parties themselves were not there. And there could be this sense of skepticism that the political factions are making and cutting agreements, and we're left in the shadows doing nothing. So this could be a very, very long process. And I think the real objectives are, at what point do you find a power sharing agreement, a technical agreement, that includes some of the warring factions, that incentivizes a notion of let's not fight, but let's find a way in which we can repatriate you back into the state, into the institutions of state, and find a peaceful solution going forward. That could possibly take years, and I think many of the examples, of the contemporary examples from sub-Saharan Africa, from Liberia, from Angola and from Rwanda, they don't always show a utopian end to all the conflict, but they do show a way in which we can begin to stabilize and then build. So I think if we think of this process as taking months, then I think we're far short of the expectations of at least the UN and some of the parties that are there. This could take years.
Manal, Omar, do you agree with that? How long is it going to take to find that common ground that might lead to a solution?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think that it could, and in fact, I would even argue that it should take years, because to really be able to talk about rebuilding the state, rebuilding the social contract between a government that people actually have trust and faith in is going to be a long process. I think what we were hoping is that in the short term, one of the goals will be, as already previously mentioned by Enes, is to really be bringing in the warring factions to at least stop the violence. I think if you really look at the situation in Libya today, it's still at a point where you could have a national reconciliation and a conversation around the new government. The concern is, as long as if the fighting and the violence continues, then you are no longer able to have that on a national level. It will then translate to a people to people, a family to family, a tribe to tribe, and at that point it's very difficult to bring Libya back from the violence. Whereas as it is today, there is still some hope for a national reconciliation if the process continues.
Is that why the European Union has called these talks the last chance for Libya?
I would hope it's not the last chance, but I do think that at this point, as I mentioned, you still don't have that level of absolute refusal to talk to each other on the streets. In fact, most of the polling and most of the information coming from Libya, from the people, from the civil society, is still a very strong dedication to the original intent of the revolution. If the not only the violence, but the day-to-day living, you're looking at very long lines for gasoline, you're looking at electricity shortages, schools are out. If this continues, then what will happen is on the grassroots level, people will begin to reject any type of reconciliation. It could even go to a more divided society. At this point, you're not seeing that on the streets. You're only seeing it politically, of course, which is now translating into the warring factions.
And Ash, before we talk about the way forward, let's look back a little if we can. Just explain to me, if you can, and for the benefit of those of us who don't know the ins and outs of Libya's politics like you do, are Libya's current problems down to a fight between liberals and Islamists, pro and anti-revolutionaries? Is it down to tribal disagreements, or am I simplifying too much here? Where do the fault lines in Libya lie right now?
It's a very dynamic country. Its population is dynamic, and I think there are many, many grievances, many fears, many objectives, and many dreams and many aspirations. Not all of them are utopian, as you know, I mentioned earlier on. Some of them are quite dystopian, and I think in that respect we have to kind of cut down some of the toxicity. So ultimately, this notion that there is a secularism versus an Islamism, to some degree there is a degree of truth there, or liberalism versus Islamism. But we should all be aware that none of the parties in Libya are immune from extremism. None of them are immune from this kind of partisan militancy that we witness. So liberals in Libya are very, very happy to commit the same kind of violence that Islamists are there for. And I think in that respect, that's why the dialogue is so important, that we can immunise this narrative from saying that only one party can commit crimes. All parties commit crimes, and in wars, all parties always commit crimes. And so in that respect, trying to understand where Libya has been from a micro level, a lot of the problems that we've had is that this revolutionary narrative has tapped its way into some of the long-established grievances. So, for example, if you're living on a border community between Jemail and Zwara towards the Tunisian border, you may have tapped into a revolutionary narrative of, winner takes all. So Zwara was on the right side of the revolution. Jemail perhaps was perceived not to be, and therefore it was winner takes all. Winner takes all in that area means they control the border, they control the traffic of goods, and ultimately, Jemail is now economically marginalised. That's been festering for 3.5 years, and it's now playing out in front of the screens, it's now playing out in front of the Libyans, and it's now becoming part of a new narrative, which some of the political factions are tapping into. They're saying, well, join Dignity or join Dawn. But in fact, it's a very, very micro problem that needs to be solved, through micro solutions, through local solutions that are, based between their own stakeholders and their own tribes. So there is a degree of truth to saying that sometimes it's a political dispute, sometimes it's an ideological dispute, sometimes it's a tribal dispute. But to conflate all of them and say, if you're on one side or you're on one tribe, then you have to be here or you have to be on this side. I think it's regardless of that. I think that conflates it, and it causes more toxicity and more problems going forward.
Yeah, Manal, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think I completely agree with that idea, and just to highlight that divide of secular and Islamicists really doesn't apply in Libya the way that it applies in other countries. In particular, if you look at Egypt, everyone in Libya has a very strong religious identity. It's just a matter of their view on political Islam.
Okay, the Tripoli-based legislature has delayed its attendance at the talks over, we're told, concerns about how the talks were organised. What might those concerns be?
To a certain degree, I have to say, I'm quite sceptical about this. I think it's a lot of posturing and the need to try to have some more leverage when they get to the talks, and the need to have a degree of space for them to be able to push harder at the talks. I don't believe that the consultations didn't happen. The consultations have been happening for a very long time, but as I said earlier on, Libya Dawn is a broken coalition. A lot of it is the GNC, a lot of it is the Libya Shield, a lot of it is Misratans, and then you find, as that goes down to Zawiya, Sabrata, Gharian, and other factions, not all of them are talking, and especially on the front lines, not all of them coordinate themselves. So, they may stand against, particular things about the particular issues regarding Khalifa Haftar, but they don't agree on necessarily the way forward. So from the GNC's perspective, I don't think they've even had time to consult some of the militant sides or some of the militant factions from within Dawn, and they may be buying time. But I highly, highly doubt that there hasn't been time for consultation. Ban Ki-moon and Bernardino Leon were both in Tripoli, and they spoke to Nouri Boussahmain, who is the head of the GNC, the president of the GNC, and I think they've had ample time to discuss this. So my scepticism aside, I don't really buy it.
Okay, Manal, I see you nodding in agreement there. Has the special envoy Bernardino Leon been too hasty in setting up these talks? He says he's consulted major influences and stakeholders on the ground at length. Did he include enough of them? Has this been an inclusive enough process?
I think that for the start and where we are in the process, that the consultations have been very important. It's very difficult from an external viewpoint to really be criticizing any type of the consultations, and particularly in terms of the reconciliation. I always say that the number one rule when you're trying to start these talks is not to let perfect be the enemy of good. I think it was essential that you actually launch the talks and the process. Any further delay would begin to lose other parties. Obviously there's always room for more consultation, there's always room for more inclusivity, but I think right now for Libya, the most important part was to start the process, which is why I think the timing was the right time.
Mr. Leon, Manal says that what happens in Libya affects the whole region, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Europe, the Sahel. Is he right? What's at stake here at these talks?
I think he's most definitely right. It's something that we're highlighting here in Washington quite a bit with all the conflicts that are happening in the region, and I would say particularly with the rise of Islamic State. Unfortunately, the focus has really been narrowed down to Iraq and Syria, with Libya being one of the potentially forgotten conflicts, not really understanding the effect on the region. As you mentioned, it's not only the Middle East. When you look at the Sahel, when you look at the arms trade, when you look at Boko Haram, it's very clear that to really be able to fight extremism, which I think is one of the primary issues plaguing the region, that you need to be inclusive Libya as well.
Anas, what happens if these talks fail?
Well, more war, and I think that both sides seem quite committed so far to continue this war in many, many different ways, and I think that is the plague that will affect Libya for the future. It's the biggest. It'll be a tragedy of biblical proportions if Libya fails in the way in which many of the skeptics of the Arab Spring foretold that it could. And I think in this respect, Libya going from having a surplus under Gaddafi, a dictator, an authoritarian that never gave any of his, that never spent in the way in which the population deserved or merited, has now gone into debt. And I think the central bank's latest statement, reflects the quite dire economic circumstances that Libya is facing. A country that could have built and could have become almost a philanthropic superpower in the region, a region that is desperately needing, a country to play a positive role, whether it's in the Sahel, whether it's in the southern Mediterranean neighborhood. So we can list the problems. Economic uncertainty and austerity that is facing Europe needs a country like Libya to be able to import goods, and for that reason it's very important. But the security concerns, we're only 30 or 40 kilometers away from the closest point in Europe. That in itself, human trafficking, again, as Manal has already mentioned, ISIS already coming into the east of the country. I mean, we could list a plethora of problems there and go through how dynamic they are, but just the sheer spectre of failure in amidst all what was all that was there on the horizon of success only 3 years ago would be a tragedy.
Well, the goal of this week's peace talks is ultimately to form a unity government in Libya. Let's just remind you once again what you've been hearing here. There are two main parties at the table. On one side you've got the Libya Dawn coalition. That's composed of militiamen and politicians who want Islam to play a larger role in politics. They're mostly from Libya's third biggest city, Misrata. The coalition controls much of western Libya, including the capital, Tripoli. And fighting against them is the government of Prime Minister Abdullah al-Thani. The elected parliament that he belongs to was forced to relocate to the east when Libya Dawn took over the capital. It is internationally recognized, but was ruled unconstitutional by the Libyan Supreme Court. Manal, we've been talking about internal actors in Libya so far on the programme. Let's talk for a moment now about outside actors and their role in the country's current turmoil. Egypt and the UAE on the one side, Qatar and Turkey on the other. To what extent do those nations perhaps hold the key to solving Libya's problems?
Well, I think that they are definitely very active in Libya, and I would say are part of the problem in terms of the way it's being moved forward. I would say, I'm a strong advocate that when you're talking about the key to solving the problem, it has to come internally, it has to come from the Libyan people. Ideally, I would like to see the regional players extract themselves and really leave it to the Libyans to be able to continue the process. What's being created by the involvement of the regional players is an artificial dynamic of power. And I think what it's important is to really be able to bring it back to the Libyan players and to be able to determine what they can actually live with. Again, a long process that would really focus in on not only a unity government, but what would be the responsibilities, the legitimacy of the government, what they would be shepherding through. Hopefully a return to discussions on the Constitution, which is more than just a paper for the formation of government, but really is an agreement between how the government will work with each other, but more importantly, how it will work with the people. Again, it's the social contract that continues to be missing in Libya. For all of those discussions to be successful, I would argue it's very important that the international community use whatever leverage they have on the regional players to extract themselves and leave it to the Libyan leaders to be the ones making the final decisions and discussions.
Anas, do you agree with that regional players and their meddling, it's making the situation worse, not better?
Absolutely. I think Manal couldn't have said it better, and I couldn't have said it better than Manal. Ultimately, the problems that are expedited because of this level of international involvement is just fueling an already very, very toxic flame. and a flame that is completely out of the control of many of the political leaders. At the moment, I would say, the international community does have a role to play in Libya. If they can minimise the involvement from some of the countries that are aiding this kind of proxy war, that are aiding some of the warring factions to look at it as a zero-sum game, to isolate some of the spoilers in Libya, that would be the best case scenario. And I think, there's always a useful role to play with. There's always a useful role to play in a conflict like this, because some of the international partners, whilst they've already been, pushing some of the lines of conflict further than where they should have been, can also bring it back and say, we're no longer involved in this, you're on your own. Some of the Libyans that are spoilers today in the current conflict need to know that they're isolated. They need to know that they're alone in this, and I think that's possibly one of the first solutions going forward. As Manal said, the constitution is possibly the only lease of life today in the current cycle of conflict. They're relatively more immune than some of the other parties, and they haven't come out and tarnished their name or sullied the idea of having a constitution that could be inclusive.
Manal, you talked about the international community, the wider international community applying pressure on the situation. I mean, could you envisage a situation, if the situation continues to deteriorate in Libya, where we see further international intervention in Libya?
I think that would be something that we would have to measure very carefully as the international community. Again, the positive element in Libya is that the Libyan people over and over are emphasizing a commitment to the revolution. I think a more direct involvement from the international community could change that. It could fuel conversations about people who are outside, people who don't belong into Libya, moving it away from any of the domestic issues or the nation building process that I think would be essential to keeping that unity, keeping that commitment. So I would advocate for the international community to support all the local players. It's very important that we're not seen choosing one side over the other, particularly because of the Supreme Court ruling, and you don't want to undermine at least the framework of a process of rule of law, which Libya is still, again, with all the chaos, it's hard to say this in terms of talking about rule of law, but you have that general framework, and to, undermine it, I think would take away any type of legitimacy from any of the parties. So the international community should be involved indirectly and really supporting all the different Libyan partners.
And as I see you nodding in agreement.
Absolutely. I think there's this notion of the currency of legitimacy, and the democratic mileage that is left in the country. It's very, very sensitive. You don't want to damage it over the spectre of maybe a year or 18 months and then damage it for life. And I think that's, for me, I think it's the framework that we work in. It's this moral principle as well, that each side has the need and desire to be involved in the long term. But I suppose when speaking about the international community's role, I would also say, and caveat what I said earlier on, that ultimately, spoilers are there, and I think you have to have the spectre of a stick and carrot approach. You can't just incentivize, and then have absolutely no ability to reprimand or to bring back some of the warring factions from the brink. So I think that's the way that I would look at it. I would say that you have to have at least a spectre of the international community there hovering over in the way they did in 2011.
I mean, we're almost out of time. A brief answer from you, if we can get one, please. I just, as we said earlier in the programme, these talks are underway. Okay, at the moment, one side isn't even in attendance, but you've got to start somewhere. Are we at a turning point, do you think, for Libya? Are you optimistic that Libya can put its problems behind it, and this is where things begin to get better?
I continue to be an optimist when it comes to Libya because of my interactions with the people in civil society and their commitment. Even if these particular talks fail, I wouldn't even use the word failure. I would say it's a false start and that we would be able to reinvigorate the conversation. My only concern would be if the violence in the day-to-day living is difficult, then you will have that goodwill from the people begin to dissipate. And I think we still have time before that happens.
Anas Al-Gomati, Manal, Omar, many thanks to you both for being with us on today's Inside Story, and thanks to you for watching. Don't forget, you can let us know your thoughts about our discussion or any other of our discussions or Inside Story. Just go to our website at aljazeera.com, post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can tweet us at AJ Inside Story. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finighan. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again. Bye for now.